The Amtrak Piedmont is a commuter service that runs between Charlotte and Raleigh, North Carolina, and in my eyes is at least a very obscure railroad to the rail fan community, and I want to be able to shed some light on this wonderful service. So, without yapping too much, I'm the Carolinian-scum. This is the history of the Amtrak Piedmont. In 1995, the North Carolina Department of Transportation, or NCDOT, as well as Amtrak and Norfolk Southern, established the Amtrak Piedmont service. This was due to Charlotte's massive growth within a few decades, allowing them to connect to the capital of North Carolina, that being Raleigh, with many stops in between, with places like Kannapolis, Salisbury, High Point, Greensboro, Burlington, Durham, and Cary. This was also a line to be used as an alternative to the Carolinian, which ran between Charlotte, North Carolina, and New York, which had a stop in Raleigh. The service started on May 27, 1995. The train concepts back then were very interesting, utilizing old Amtrak legacy coaches that Amtrak were trying to retire that were still in the Phase 3 livery. The fleet started off with two GP40 PH-2s, those being named the City of Raleigh, 1792, and 1768 named the City of Charlotte. The engines were painted in a gray paint scheme with a blue front end with the letters NC on the front with a white star in the middle, and white and red stripes on the sides to represent the North Carolina flag. When tests were run, it was very clear that 1792 was running a lot better than 1768, due to 1768 not having a lot of maintenance on its freight career prior to its passenger service, causing 1768 to be commonly seen being towed behind 1792. Later in the year, Amtrak Piedmont service would add a temporary extension to Clemson, South Carolina to support the brand new NFL team, that being the Carolina Panthers. In 1996, the Amtrak Piedmont service purchased an originally Milwaukee Road Superdome that had gained ownership from Amtrak. This was then used on the Piedmont service, which increased ridership with a large car that had beautiful views of the very urban areas of North Carolina. Though the car would not be used very often after 2002 and would eventually be sold off in 2005, and currently we do not know where it is. Some people are saying that it's in the Western Maryland Scenic Railroad, but I think that's a different car. I don't know exactly. However, in July of 1997, the first of few incidents in the Piedmont service would occur in Elfland, after 1792 crashed into the side of a Toyota Camry that crossed the tracks at the last second. There was only minor damage and burns to the front of the plate. Not much info was given about the condition of the driver, but it is assumed they didn't survive. In 1998, NCDOT purchased a few F-59 PHIs to run on the Piedmont service. The GP40s were starting to age and the service was getting more popular. However, the budget of the Amtrak Piedmont was starting to decay. Due to this, in 1999, 1768, the City of Charlotte was deactivated and eventually sold to the Virginia Railway Express in 2001, eventually retiring in 2014, which solved the issue with the budget, but in turn left 1792 as the sole GP40 left in the Amtrak fleet. In 1999, the first F-59 PHI entered service, that being engine 1797 being named City of Asheville. A few years later in 2002, there would be the second F-59 PHI that would enter service as engine 1755 being named City of Salisbury. This would enter a few years later than 1797 due to the budget cuts that happened, causing the build to be slowed down, but after 1768 was sold, they sped up the build and that would go into service alongside their sister. However, in 2006, 1755 would be involved in an accident after a boat with a good lord. However, In 2005, 1755 would be involved in an accident after a trailer with a boat on it had stopped on a grade crossing, and 1755 hit the trailer. It would end up with massive front end damage, but the engine would return to service after quite a cheap repair job, with the locomotive looking quite beat up, but would get a fresh new paint job in 2017 and eventually would get fully repaired in 2009, but would run without a front clip for about 3 years until they eventually replaced the front clip in early 2012. Behind the scenes, though, things were starting to get a bit more sad for the original flagship locomotive of the Piedmont. 1792 would rarely be used on the railroad, and it was showing that the F-59 PHIs were a lot easier to maintain, but 1792 would still be run every now and then, most of the time either being a backup locomotive when one was in the shops, or towing a broken engine back to the station. However, on May 13th, 2010, 1792 would be heading for Charlotte after making the turnaround at Raleigh, but they wouldn't even make it past Greensboro, as in Mebane a lowboy trailer carrying an excavator would get stuck on the grade crossing in Mebane, and despite the roaring horn and the bell from 1792 would slam into the trailer, causing it to derail off the tracks and the hook of the excavator hitting a car. The cars would catch on fire and quickly spread to the first passenger car, but luckily the fire department was not too far away from the derailment and would extinguish the fire 3 minutes after it started. 13 would be injured from the crash, but luckily no one would pass away from the incident, and the only major problem being soil that had been contaminated from the fuel and the fires. 1792 would deal massive front-end damage and a bent frame that would spell the demise of the original poster boy of the Amtrak Piedmont. It would be scrapped shortly after the incident, with the bell being saved and put on a fountain to commemorate the incident. In November of 2011, testing would go underway for a new fleet of locomotives on the Piedmont service, that being F-59PH number 1869, that being named City of Durham. The F-59PHs would soon grow to be the common face of the Piedmont, with 9 of them being built, 3 of them being cab control units, allowing for easier turnarounds heading back to Charlotte. In preparation for this new fleet, earlier in the year, NCDOT, Amtrak, and Norfolk Southern reached to an agreement to update infrastructure, add additional double track and passings, as well as reduce curves, increasing speed on the main line for the Piedmont to 90 miles per hour rather than 79 miles per hour, like in the past, which cut down times around 25 minutes. In 2014, 1755 would show up in a massive event at the North Carolina Transportation Museum in Spencer, North Carolina, alongside many other vintage streamlined diesels, as well as the soon-to-be restored Norfolk and Western 611, at the Streamliners at Spencer event. 1755 would be a display locomotive, allowing for visitors to visit the passenger cars and check the inside of the cars. In March of 2025, it was announced that Amtrak would begin debuting their Amtrak Aero train sets, and the lines that would use them, Amtrak Piedmont was planning on getting them, but we do not know exactly when they will arrive. But there's a lot of modernization plans that Amtrak are planning right now, and I don't have a lot of motivation to look at that kind of research, so if you can go ahead and look at a different video to learn about that. Finally, to top off the history of the Amtrak Piedmont service, we come to the modern day, where on May 26, 2025, Amtrak repainted City of Burlington F-59PH number 1893 to represent the old GP40s that ran back in the beginning of the Piedmont service, to celebrate their 30th anniversary. In my opinion, I love this engine. I never got to see the old GP40s growing up, since by the time 1972 had crashed, I was only 3 years old, and by the time I knew the Piedmont existed, I hated it. My 7-year-old foamer brain wanted to see a P42 and got this blue piece of shit. Days after learning the history of the Amtrak Piedmont, I'm very happy of its existence, and e- I would be happy to see that engine show up, even if it's not the same engine. Just to yap about my experience with the railroad itself, I love the Piedmonts. Even though as a kid I didn't really like them, learning about the history of them turned me into a bit of a fan. I've only had one opportunity to ride them, and that was a trip from Charlotte, North Carolina to Salisbury, North Carolina, with my father, and I can say it's a really nice way to travel. The cars, despite them being older than the railroad itself, they had a lot of legroom, and the leg rests were very comfortable, as well as the self serve diner car. The vending machines in there were very cheap, and the coffee was free. In the end, what started off as a cheaper alternative train turned into what is, in my opinion, the most underrated and most underappreciated commuter trains in America. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed today's video. This is a bit of a different turn than what I would usually post. I haven't been posting a lot on this channel mainly because I haven't had a lot of motivation to make these kinds of videos because I don't have the energy or the ideas to try it out. But I do plan on making maybe more videos. It just depends on how I feel and if I think it'll get any recognition. I do want to also mention the fact that I have made a rolling line mod bringing out the Amtrak Piedmont cars, since there was a mod for a rolling line for the Amtrak Piedmont passenger cars, but they were not working. So I decided to take matters in my own hands and make it myself. I'm very proud of it. It is on the Steam Workshop completely for free if you own the game Rolling Line. So I would be highly appreciated if you gave it a shot, as well as the two other creators that made the trains for the Piedmont service. I do have plans to make a 30th anniversary livery for the railroad, but I don't know if I'm going to have the energy to make it myself. So it's either I'm going to wait for someone else to make it or I'll make it myself. But it all just depends on if I have the energy to make it all. But for now, hope y'all have a lovely day. Stay safe, stay hydrated. Love y'all. Bye bye.